Okay, today we're going to look at squares and square roots. And we sometimes call them square numbers, or sometimes it gets abbreviated to just squares. And squaring means multiplying by itself. And the reason it's called square is it comes from a square. If I look at this example here, if I have this square that's 4 units by 4 units, you see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 small squares in between. So 4 times 4 is 16. And we can also call that 4 squared. So sometimes we might say 3 squared, which would be 3 times 3. The square of 9 is another way of describing it. So that would be 9 times 9. So we sometimes use different words to describe the same thing. And we use an index or a power, 3 with a small 2, and we call that a power of 2. And that means 3 squared. It's another way of writing it. And 3 times 3 is, of course, 9. We can write this as 9 squared, 9 with a little 2, a power of 2. And 9 squared is 81. So there's lots of different ways of describing the same thing. And so these numbers here, 16, 9, 81, are what we call square numbers. And so the first 10 square numbers would be 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 2 is 4, 3 times 3 is 9, 4 times 4, 16, 5 squared is 25, 6 squared is 36, 7 squared is 49, 8 squared 64, 9 squared 81, 10 squared 100, and these are what we call the square numbers. They keep going on. We can keep going for as long as we want to. These are really useful. They come up all the time. So this is called squaring, or finding the square of, and square numbers, and sometimes abbreviated to just squares. The opposite process of this is finding the square root. So the square root of 36, we'd look and say, well, 36 is 6 times 6. So the square root of 36 is 6. So basically what we're saying is which number when multiplied by itself would get us back to 36. And we have a sign for this. And the sign for this is like a tick that goes over the top of the number. So if I ask what's the square root of 49, it would be 7. Now actually there's a little bit more to this than meets the eye. Because if I talk about 7 squared, so 7 squared, which would be 7 times 7, which would be 49. But actually, if I did negative 7 squared, that would be negative 7 multiplied by negative 7. And a negative times a negative gives me a positive. So that would also give me 49. So actually, the square root of 49 is 7 or negative 7. So actually, either of those could be given as the answer. Sometimes you just ask for the positive square root. Sometimes you might be asked for both values. So often they have 2 values. So strictly speaking, if I say what's the square root of 100, it's 10 or negative 10. So usually we just give the positive version, but sometimes you'll be asked for the negative version as well. So these is what we call the square root. Now there's only square numbers that have whole number square roots. So if I was to ask for the square number of, say, 70, I know that square root of 64 would be 8. So write that down. Square root of 64 would be 8, because 8 times 8 is 64. The square root of 81 would be 9. So the square root of 70 would be somewhere in between. And we would need our calculator to find this. Now on most calculators there is a button that has that square root sign. So you need your calculator, type it into your calculator, and if I type that in, you actually get a very long decimal, 8.36660, and it goes on and on and on. So sometimes we might have to round this number. So squaring a number means multiplying it by itself. The square root of a number means which number multiplies by itself to get that number. And just be careful, because sometimes you might be asked for the negative square root as well.